So where the Judaism of being says there are no good Jews and no bad Jews, there are just Jews, the Judaism of becoming says, well, I have a particular way of doing Jewish things that I think is the right way to do it. And if you're not doing it that way, maybe you're not a good Jew. And we're going to look at some texts that really, pick up on that, right? We looked at the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, at the end of our session last class, and he basically says, "Will ye or nil ye? You once Jewish, always Jewish," right? You can't convert out. And his startling test case of that is a person who lived much of her life Anglican and wants to come back to be Jewish. And he says, you can't reconvert. You never left. We do not accept your having left as an actual action, right? But on the other side of that is, we're going to look at the Rambam today, and the Rambam has sort of a very different approach to what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be outside of the realm of Jewish community. So we're going to look at that text. Before we look at the text, we'll start with the lecture. I did want to ask if anybody had any comments on my introductory remarks before we go into the lecture. All right. So the lecture again, like last week, is by David Hartman, and he's going to explain his this idea of the Judaism of becoming. All right. I think I didn't share it optimized for video clip. There we go. Okay.
In the last session, we delved into the meaning of Judaism as founded on the covenant of being. Today, we will explore the other side of Jewishness, the covenant of becoming. As we will see, it is a covenant that moves Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood in a very different and essential way. We will start by exploring the essence of this covenant and its consequences for understanding Jewish peoplehood and the way it differs from the covenant of being. In the end, we will study how the two were and need to be interwoven together into the story we tell ourselves about who we are, a story about our beginnings, but more importantly about where we can and need to go in the future, both in Israel and around the world. I will then explore these issues in greater depth in an interview with my colleagues, Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain and Rabbi Shai Zarchi. The covenant of being, introduced in Genesis, covers a broad swath of cultural and conceptual territory, both the early lived reality of Jews during the biblical period and a foundational understanding of Jewish identity that abides to this day. And yet, it is only the first element of the Jewish peoplehood story. The second element is fully fleshed out in the book of Exodus, where the Jewish people are first called by God into what I call the covenant of becoming. The covenant of becoming constructs Jewish identity primarily as a journey along a path, a way of life defined by particular behaviors and beliefs, an enduring commitment to live a life of value and holiness. It is a covenant of becoming because, to paraphrase the rabbis, one never completes the journey. As humans, we never fully arrive. To live with commandments is to never desist from the lifelong project of self-improvement, of working to actualize one's many latent potentialities and gifts and live a life increasingly aligned with the challenges placed before us by God. The essence of this covenant is perhaps most elegantly expressed in the most frequently recurring verse in the Bible. And God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say unto them." What follows are hundreds of divine aspirations for humanity, 613 to be exact, translated into a commandment to act. It is in the response to this calling that Jewish identity is endowed with purpose, that it ceases to be a mere accident of birth, something both inherited and imposed, and is transformed into a choice and a mission to create a life of value. This new dimension of Jewishness is first presented 3 months after the Jewish people's exodus from Egypt, at the moment that they are standing at the footsteps of Mount Sinai. It is at this point that Moses receives the following introductory message from God. The Lord called him from the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and declare to the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my commandments, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel." The critical word identifying this covenant is the word if, a word that has no place in the covenant of being. There, the covenant is unilateral divine promise. Here it becomes something that its human partners are awarded only if they keep and obey. Only in exchange for doing so will God keep the divine side of the covenant and single out the Jews as a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. It is after this introduction, and as an expression of what it demands, that the Bible moves to outline the 10 Commandments, the backbone of the covenant of becoming. "I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make yourself a sculptured image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house." In the narrative of the covenant of becoming, the exodus from Egypt catalyzes a new phase of Jewish collective meaning and identity. The same God who took you out of the land of Egypt because of responsibilities to the descendants of Abraham based on the covenant of being, now from the mountaintop at Sinai demands something in return, namely obedience, loyalty, and faith. "You shall have no other gods besides me." While the covenant of being is essentially a one-sided manifesto of God's commitment to the Jewish people, the covenant of becoming binds God and the Jewish people together by a reciprocal covenant of divine aspiration and human obligation. The 10 Commandments returns our focus, and that of the tradition as a whole, back to the moment at which Abraham was called by God on a mission to leave his entire known world, go, lech lecha, and calls on the rest of us to respond as Abraham did, rising early to strike out on a new path of intimacy and relationship with the divine. The revelation of the Torah at Sinai is essentially the collective Lech Lecha moment of the Jewish people.
All right, I stopped him a little early because I reread my notes to myself, and I think that it would be better for us to look at some of the texts and then continue the lecture after we look at the text. So we'll come back to him. And now he's given you his introduction. And what we're going to do now is split into breakout rooms. I've got us split into 3 rooms, and we're going to take 12 minutes in the breakout rooms. So you should pace yourselves. Make sure to look at text 9, which I think is in some ways the most interesting. But before you get to text 9, spend a little bit of time, like texts 1, 2, and 3 all have a similar concept. So you could just do, you could just skim through text 1 and 2 and focus on text 3. Similarly, texts 4, 5, 6, and 7 have a similar concept, and then go straight to text 8 and 9. And I think text 9, spend the most amount of time on that. And if we decide that we need a little bit more time than 12 minutes, we can definitely do that. So I'm going to split into rooms. I'm also going to bounce around into each of the rooms this time. All right. So everybody, please do join a room.
Okay.
Ellen?
Yeah, there I am.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi there, how are you? I am a person.
Yes. And a cousin.
Yes, we still have to have that conversation. More so, we had a little of it. Anyway,
Right.
so
I'm not sure what to do with these things. I mean, these are all familiar. At least the
Yeah.
earlier ones are.
I can't hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very
We-
strange.
Well, one
All right,
was the,
well,
is
you just
the
carry on while I
Sinai.
figure that out.
Yeah, one is Sinai, and that's
Yeah.
where God says, I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, but you got to keep the covenant.
Well, number 2 is the 10 Commandments right there,
Yeah.
as given
Yeah.
first time around it in Yitro. Right.
right,
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
first one is the preliminary to that, right? So, I mean,
right.
you
That's
just,
and then the, I don't know.
Third one.
The third one basically says that they need to listen to God because he is the Holy One and everything can sort of change, I guess.
yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, it's interesting. This phrase is repeated many times. It's, you should be holy for I, the Lord, am man holy.
Right.
How can I be holy? Does it mean
Well-
following all the rules?
Principles,
Yes,
but what principles?
I think they're the ones on page 48. That's the other reading from
Oh,
Maimonides.
I think that that Perek Galek, it has like the 13 principles of belief.
Yes,
Maimonides.
right. That's what this is on page 48.
48. I didn't read as far as 48.
There, I mean,
the bottom,
believing in the existence of the Creator, the
Yeah.
uniqueness of God, denying the corporeality of God, etc.
yeah,
You know,
13 Maimonides principles.
my own reaction to these things that Jews are supposed to do is that they come sort of in 3 categories. One are categories that really seem to get right at the heart of things, like compassion and sensitivity to the poor. And then there are ones that are establishing a connection with God. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of them that seem not at the same level and not so important, like wearing fringes, with the correct dye in one of the threads or something. So I sort of see 3 different kinds of things.
And where do you then put the Maimonides principles of?
Huh. Okay. So Rabbi, it would be helpful if we could share the screen so we could put the text up, but host is currently disabled screen sharing. Because not everybody has the text in front of them.
I don't think we can screen share and
Oh,
see.
but Rabbi has the power.
Oh
I
dear.
should be able to make it so that all of you can do that. Let me see.
I don't know if that interacts with breakout rooms.
That was the question that I meant.
I'm trying to remember if I've ever seen screen sharing in breakout rooms, and I don't know if I have.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That is something I can work on, maybe not like at this exact moment, but between now and next class.
I was going to comment that the words that are being used in this criticism that Maimonides, or this proposed, I almost want to use the word fatwa. Not entirely inappropriate. The word for heretic that's being used here is mean, if that has resonance with you. The word for apostate is abikoros, which is a word some people will know.
Yeah.
And cuts the plantings is kotses bantiot. And that's a reference to, Mishka will probably know the reference to the four who entered the Garden of Eden. One of them went insane, one of them died, and one of them cut down plantings. And the fourth one, Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and departed in peace.
Yeah, I would say that, right, so Maimonides, no, this one I think he wrote in Hebrew. I was about to tell you that it's a translation anyway, so it's not necessarily his exact words. But I think that he wrote Mishnah Torah in Hebrew, not in Judeo-Arabic or Arabic.
I think that's right.
But his other works, the Moreh Nevuchim, for sure, when you read that in Hebrew, it's somebody else's translation of Maimonides from the Arabic. But yes, here he's deliberately referring to that Talmudic passage.
Yeah.
I'm confused. Where's the covenant of circumcision? Wouldn't that be part of the becoming? That's in Genesis.
For sure. But I would say this, right? Abraham is for sure a Jew of becoming, right? Abraham has to do stuff. But Abraham's grandchildren are just born into it.
Still, they have to go by the circumcision. They have to, and in that way, they're. I'm not remembering what is the part of the covenant that they have to give to God.
We do give
in circumcision.
I'm not sure. I don't really understand your question, but
what is the obligation of the Jewish male? Isn't there a moral obligation along with the
the deal with Abraham is your ancestors will inherit the land, and if that's a breach, then there's got to be something on the other side. And is circumcision the quid pro quo for inheriting the land for the descendants of Abraham?
I mean, I do not think that's how Jewish tradition understands it, but it might be that's how Genesis 12 understands it. But I don't. Circumcision is also commanded in other places in Jewish tradition. We do source it to Genesis, but we also, it's very clear from reading Torah that Jews did not circumcise between the Exodus from Egypt and entering the land of Israel. Those whole 40 years, they did not circumcise their children, because in the book of Joshua, the whole nation circumcises all at once. They wouldn't need to do that if they were circumcising. What?
Didn't the Egyptians circumcise?
I have no idea. Like, you're asking a historical question about which I do not know.
I thought maybe that's what they got it from.
What we do know is right. In Joshua, you have to be circumcised to partake of the Passover offering, and they clearly don't celebrate Passover in the desert. And then they do in the book of Joshua once they've entered the land. So I don't know what that does for the Judaism of being and the Judaism of becoming for you, Sonia.
I guess I'm just going to have to go back and read the original text. I'll report back next week.
If I can ping us back to chapter 9.
All right, well, it seemed like there were some nice conversations going on there. I hope I didn't pull you back too soon. Let's jump into the rest of the lecture, and then we will discuss the whole both the lecture and the texts.
Not satisfied with viewing Jewishness only as a modality of being, the covenant of becoming casts Jewish identity as a mission. In the words of Isaiah, "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, my servant whom I have chosen, to the end that you may take thought and believe in me and understand that I am he. Before me no God was formed, and after me none shall exist." Why the change from being to becoming? In one of the narratives associated with the covenant of becoming, the reason for the shift is explained in developmental terms as part of the maturation of the Jewish people. In the book of Deuteronomy, at the moment the children of Israel are poised to cross the Jordan and enter into the promised land, the 10 commandments are retold. Here, however, they are introduced differently. It states, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I proclaim to you today. Study them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Chorev," which is the biblical term for Mount Sinai. "It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today." It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant. The covenant of being is what brought you here. The Jewish people are told in preparation for the next phase of their collective evolution. Before you were a nation, the covenant of being was sufficient. When you grew into a nation, but were mere slaves or wanderers in the desert with no responsibility to build and shape your society, the covenant of being was still sufficient. Now, however, as you're about to enter into your promised land and become an independent nation with power and responsibility over your country, the covenant of being is no longer sufficient. Becoming a sovereign nation, Moses argues, requires nothing short of a break from the old mindset, an entirely new orientation towards Jewish identity. Over and again, the book of Deuteronomy states, "Now this is the commandment, the statutes and ordinances, which the Lord your God commanded to teach you, that you will do them in the land." Or, "These are the statutes and ordinances which you shall observe to do in the land, which the Lord your God of your fathers has given you to possess." The covenant of becoming is intertwined with entering the land of Israel. Living as Jews of being was but a temporary initial reality, a preparatory stage awaiting your maturation. It is only when living as Jews of becoming that the new, permanent, fully realized chapter of Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood begins. This narrative of 2 developmental stages in Jewish peoplehood, the first prior to Jewish sovereignty and the responsibility it entails, and the other after, develops 2 very different notions of chosenness. For the Jew of being, chosenness is inherited, an unearned and inscrutable status hidden within the infinite will and wisdom and love of the divine. God, without explanation or even the slightest prelude, turns to Abraham and commands him to go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Abraham is plucked from total anonymity, out of the totality of humankind, and given a unique opportunity to be in a covenantal relationship with God if he will pass the test and go where God instructs him. His descendants, in turn, inherit the blessing of Abraham simply by being born of his seed into a covenant of being. The Jewish people, who are not yet responsible for building their society, are also not responsible for carrying the covenant. In the second stage, which gives birth to the covenant of becoming, Jewishness unfolds in the context of a responsibility to align one's individual and collective actions and beliefs with God's will, of building a society of value. At this stage of maturation, election is no longer an inheritance, but a responsibility and an insistent claim. Chosenness is not bestowed. It must be realized. To be chosen means to be selected for something, like a responsibility or task, not as something, like an elevated status. In this paradigm, covenantal partnership is not a permanent function of the past election of Abraham, but a variable status that must continually be established and reestablished by one's actions in the present. As the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30 declares, "See, I set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in God's ways, and to keep God's commandments, laws and rules that you may thrive and increase, and the Lord your God may bless you in the land that you are about to enter and possess. But if your heart turns away and you give no heed and are lured into worship and service of other gods, I declare to you this day that you shall certainly perish. You shall not long endure on the soil that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day." And the text continues, "I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, if you and your offspring would live, by loving the Lord your God, heeding God's commands, and holding fast to God. For thereby you shall have life and shall long endure upon the soil that the Lord swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them." The same land which under the covenant of being was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob unconditionally, under the rules of the covenant of becoming, must now be earned. The life of the Jewish people and what its Jewishness entails has evolved. The beauty and significance of the covenant of becoming for the meaning of Jewishness lies precisely in the fact that it is a covenant which challenges and demands that Jewishness be not merely who you are, but what you do. Jewishness cannot be exhausted by an accident of birth. Rather, it expects of the Jewish people excellence, nothing short of the emulation of none other than God. It finds its ultimate expression in the verse, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." God is not merely the source of benevolence and blessing, but the object of striving and our model to emulate. To enter into the covenant is not simply to be chosen for a reward, but to be challenged to emulate God's qualities. However, together with this level of expectation, there comes another side, a price, if you will. In the covenant of becoming, it becomes possible to categorize Jews, distinguish between those who are more godlike from those who are less, those holier than others, those who are good and those who are bad. With these distinctions, the core tolerance and experience of grace, where a Jew is a Jew is a Jew, all equally loved by God under the covenant of being, is rescinded. God is the God who bestows forbearing tolerance on all Jews, who models the standard for human emulation. Just as God tolerates an expansive range of diversity within the covenant of being, so must we aspire to total inclusivity around our communal table. In its stead emerges the assessments of righteousness. Those who do not conform to a set of prevalent beliefs and practices are no longer beloved, no longer Jews in good standing. This assessment emerges already at the beginning of the narrative of the covenant of becoming in the Ten Commandments. There, together with the commandment of "You shall have no other gods besides me, and you shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or bow down to them," comes the warning, "For I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments." What makes the consequence of this dimension of the covenant of becoming even more significant is that it is not God alone who rejects those who fail to live up to the covenant's expectations. Here too, we can be commanded to emulate God and rescind our tolerance of the sinner as well. As you saw in Maimonides, one of Judaism's staunchest advocates for the covenant of becoming, the covenant demands of its adherents acceptance of 13 principles of faith. For Maimonides, they are the principal gateway through which all Jews become Jews, and not the covenant of being. And as he states, and when an individual believes in these principles and their truth is clarified to him, then he or she enters into Israel, and we are commanded to love and to have compassion upon him and to treat him or her in all the ways that God commands a human being to treat his or her fellow Jew, with love and compassion. In the powerfully becoming-based theology of Maimonides, one becomes a Jew by passing through the gauntlet of a sequence of beliefs. The moment one accepts these beliefs, one is in turn accepted into the community as an insider and is rewarded with love and compassion. This, in turn, leads to the adverse side of this admittance policy, which entails a strict exclusion policy for those who deviate from these core beliefs, a policy incoherent from the standpoint of the covenant of being. Quoting again Maimonides, who says, "But when a person's faith in one of these principles is corrupted, he has separated from the community. He is a heretic in the essence. He is called a heretic, an apostate, and an individual who cuts the plantings. It is a commandment to hate him and to destroy him. And about him it is said, 'Your enemy, God, I will hate. Those who hate you, God, I will hate.' The love and loyalty between fellow members are now conditional, as we are commanded to emulate God in our distribution of love and hate. It is the covenant of becoming which also ultimately leads to the preponderance of denominations in Jewish life. While denominationalism does not inherently entail hate and rejection of those you perceive to be bad Jews, it does emerge out of a commitment to a particular sense of how one best fulfills Judaism's aspirations and challenge to be holy. Within the context of the covenant of becoming, belonging is no longer to the whole people as a whole, but also to a particular worship community, which best shares one understanding of what God wants and demands, and to the building of two proverbial synagogues, the one which I go to and the one which I do not. A Jew may still be a Jew, but there are Jews with whom I pray, and most importantly, Jews with whom I do not. The covenant of being and becoming represent two very different stories of Jewish peoplehood. What is fascinating is that in the Bible they coexist. The covenant of being was the principal Jewishness of the Jews, while the covenant of becoming was the aspirational Jewishness of God. All the while, God still holding on to the covenant of being. While, as we saw, the narrative of the covenant of becoming may attempt to position itself as the superior one, the appropriate manifestation of the Jewish people's development out of childhood and its covenant of being. If you remember the prior session, that's not the way the Bible and the subsequent Jewish tradition ultimately came to understand the relationship between the two. We are the inheritors of a Judaism and a people who embody both being and becoming. Being and becoming both have and continue to define us and challenge us. This complex inheritance generates an imperative to include both covenants in our account of Jewishness and keep them in an ongoing dialogue with each other, a dialogue that is never resolved, because the answer to who are the Jewish people must entail a combination of both. In our story of amalgamation, we come to learn that each alone would be deficient. If the story of the Jews was only that of being, it would be mediocre, no matter how tolerant it is of Jewish behavior. The Jewish people would be a people who feel loved by God, but not challenged to move beyond that point. Jewishness would be an ornament, an award, with no vision or contribution to our world. On the other hand, If the story of the Jews was only that of becoming, there would be a preponderance of mutual judgmentalism, and no Jewish people, only denominations, competing for the mantle of holiness and uprightness in the eyes of God. Jewishness would be less of an identity and more of an individual journey, constantly restless in the aspiration to become more. The Jewish people are stronger, healthier, and more vibrant when the covenant of being and becoming dance together. This dance is not merely the story of Jewish people over the ages, but a blueprint for our future. There is a Zionism of being and a Zionism of becoming. There is a Jewish life in North America which embraces being and one which embraces becoming. Part of the story and challenge of contemporary Jewish life is how to move our people, whether in North America or in Israel, away from choosing one over the other. How to avoid one community identifying particularly with being and the other with becoming. How to avoid stigmatizing and simplifying our perceptions of the other by associating them with only one covenant. Use the categories to think about your Jewishness. Use them as a lens through which to understand the complexities of contemporary Jewish life and its challenges. And most importantly, tell a story which contains them both. For we are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Thank you.
All right, so thoughts and reactions. Sonia, you have to unmute.
He mentioned the 13 principles of faith.
Maimonides is, yeah.
What is that? I mean, there's the 10 Commandments and then there's the 613, but I've never heard of the 13.
Yeah, Maimonides' 13 principles of faith are to believe in the existence of God as the creator, to believe in the uniqueness of God, okay, to deny the corporeality of God, meaning God doesn't have a body. 4, to recognize the primacy of God and the fact that God is eternal. 5, to understand that God alone is worthy of worship. 6, to accept prophecy, meaning that God reveals God's self to humanity. 7, to believe in the prophecy and the unique status of the prophecy of Moses, right? That is to say that the Torah is divinely inspired. Okay, that's the next one too. 8, that the Torah has a divine origin. 9, that the Torah is a direct replicate of the Word of God. 10, that God is aware of human behavior and cognizant of it. 11, that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. 12, that there is and will be a messianic era in which the world will be redeemed. And 13, that at the time of the messianic era, there will be a resurrection of the dead. It is true that in the conservative movement, we don't focus very much on Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Most Orthodox sidurs that I know of have it written out at the end of Shachrit. So like there's passages that you can read at the end of the weekday service, and many Orthodox sidurs can like have the 13 principles of faith as one of those that you can read. However, we do sing a hymn. It's called Yigdal. We sing it on Friday nights at the end of Mariv or on holidays. Yigdal Elohim Chai v'yishtaba. Right, that, and on the high holidays it goes Yigdal Elohim Chai v'yishtaba. Anyway, that tune, that hymn is a ditty. It is a version of the 13 principles of faith written out into rhyme and scan. But if you read that closely, it contains all 13 of Maimonides' principles of faith. So there you have them. Now, do I think that if you, does Maimonides think that if you don't believe those things, that you're out? Yeah, he definitely seemed to think that, at least in some of his writings. In others of his writings, it's a little bit more complicated. It's possible that Maimonides thought that the average person needed to believe these things in order to be in, but really super hyper intellectual people might be able to believe other things and still be okay. But basically, no, he basically thought that you had to believe these things. General Judaism, right? It has been said many times that you don't have to believe anything in particular to be Jewish, that Judaism is more about what you do than what you believe. And there is some truth to that. And part of the truth to that is we have different ways of thinking about what being Jewish is, right? The Judaism of being doesn't have any requirements of what you do or what you believe. And the Judaism of becoming has many different requirements, right? For example, I believe that women are people and should be considered equal to men with respect to Jewish law, right? I believe that that is a principle of my understanding of Jewishness, so much so that I think that behaving in a way that doesn't show that, i.e. not counting women in a minyan, is a mima'it et hadmut, diminishes the image of God in the world, right? That's a strong statement of sort of the wrongness of that behavior, right? That's the synagogue that I do not pray in, right? Do I acknowledge that those people who are doing that are Jewish? Yes, I'm not trying to write them out of Judaism. But do I think that they're Jewish in the best possible way? Do I think that they're following the will of God? Maybe I think that they aren't quite there yet. So Maimonides expresses it very strongly, which is why he's the example. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Well, I certainly like the way he explained that the Jewishness of being is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that for everybody else, then it has to be the Jewishness of becoming.
Well, certainly that's the way that the structure of the Torah wants you to think. But then when you go back to Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah is writing at the very end of the biblical period. And we looked at the Nehemiah text. He's fully committed to the Judaism of becoming, right? He's angry that Jews aren't following mitzvot, right? But he describes 1,000 years of Jewish history post Abraham, right? Like post entrance into the land, basically, like from Moses onward, 1,000 years of Jewish history where Jews were perfectly happy being Jews of being. Right? Like when you think about the vastness of Jewish history and you wonder, okay, how many Jews actually kept Shabbos? Right? How many Jews actually bought in to the aspirational Judaism that the Judaism of becoming demands of you? It's like fairly few, I think. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean, but I also know that life in those days would have kept people within that becoming behavior because they had to.
Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly it kept people in the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Right. But I think there were always people who weren't practicing.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
It's interesting that in the list of commandments of mitzvot, top of the list is you shall love God. which is a non-public thing. I could, you know, I
Mhm.
could see if somebody is eating treif or whatever, you know, or, you know,
Working out.
carrying on Shabbat, you know, whatever it is. But how do you know that somebody loves God? How do they know? And why would
Well,
they love God? And, you know,
when
it's
when
it,
when
it
Deuteronomy
opens up a lot
says
there, you know.
when Deuteronomy says, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your
Right.
might,"
Yeah.
it doesn't mean love like the emotion. It doesn't
Right.
mean have the emotion love with respect to God. It
So
means
ahava. Yeah.
it means do what God says,
Well, okay. All right. So
right?
that's what it's.
It means there are actions that you do that show love, right? Which I've actually found very comforting, right?
But I might do what God says because I'm afraid God's going to zap me. You know,
Right. It's
it has nothing to do with love.
God loves the Jewish people so much that God asked us to do actions. And we love
Right.
God so much that we do the actions. That's the basic idea here. And right, I find that very comforting, right? Because I haven't probably been married for as long as many of you. And Rachel and I will celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary, in September. So we've been married 9.5 years, right? I can tell you, even in my limited 9.5 years of experience, like the emotion love, it's not there all the time, but the daily I love you, right? The like what it means to have actions that show love, the like I'm gonna close the window even though I'm warm because you asked me to, right? Those actions of love, right? That is what love is sort of for the long term. It's like it's the daily behaviors that we commit to doing and that we continue to choose to do. And I sort of feel like that's also the way that God is with us, right? Like, and you shall love. It's like, so sometimes you have moments of real intimate connection with God. But a lot of the times it's, I get up every morning and I put on my tefillin and I pray the words. And maybe I have an intimate connection and maybe I don't, but I'm doing it because it adds meaning to my life and it creates a structure by which I'm able to say to God every morning, I love you. Yeah, Gary.
I appreciate the explication of ahava and love. Are you willing to take a shot at what holiness meant?
I think
I really
holiness.
don't know what that means.
Yeah, I think holiness I think when Leviticus says you shall be holy because God is holy, it means set apart. When Leviticus talks about holiness, like the word hekadesh, hekadesh are animals which have been consecrated to the temple, and then you can't slaughter them for profane purposes, like to eat. You can only slaughter them for sacrifices, right? So a thing that has been designated as holy is a thing which has been set apart for a particular use. We also talk about Jewish marriage as kiddushin, from the same word as kuf daled shin, right? It means that you and your partner are set apart from all other people for a particular covenantal relationship with each other. So when it says you shall be kadosh because God is kadosh, means that God is set apart. I'm going to say something a little heretical from the point of view of Maimonides, but less heretical from the point of view of the Bible, right? The Bible expects you to think about God as being the God that you worship among all the gods that exist. Maimonides certainly doesn't think that that's what the Bible means. Maimonides says, if you believe that there are other gods, you're out. But I think the Bible very clearly thinks that there are other gods. Well, I think that God is set apart, and that set apartness, that like being set apart for a particular relationship with us, that we also strive to be set apart in our relationship with God. Now, what does it mean to be set apart? I think the covenant of becoming says there are all of these actions that you take to show what it means to be sort of in that set apart covenantal relationship with God. God is holy and you are holy. Now, the rabbinic formulation of that is, just as God clothes the naked, so too should you clothe the naked. Just as God visits the sick, so too should you visit the sick. Right? And then the rabbis give particular examples from the Torah of God doing those actions. And the idea is, imitatio Dei means sort of living a life of moral goodness, right? So, and I think that rabbinic answer is one piece of it, but I also think that set apartness has within it other responsibilities, some which are maybe hard for us to find sort of rational or moral reasons for, but which sort of fit into this logic of being set apart for a particular purpose.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will say, I think Deuteronomy and Leviticus are in a dialogue with each other. They represent sort of the multivocality of our tradition. There are different voices within our history who are each speaking to a different way of understanding our relationship with God, right? Deuteronomy's conception of that is different from the Leviticus's conception of that. But I you know, so you're pointing directly to this, you know, the difference between and you shall love the Lord your God and you shall be holy because God is holy, right? Both of these are aspects of the Judaism of becoming, but they are different ways to conceive of the Judaism of becoming.
Well, I always thought that it was interesting that the word love is not mentioned in the Ten Commandments. And to me, the Ten Commandments seems to be best defined by respect. 1/3 would be respect for God, 1/3 respect for family, and 1/3 respect for society.
Nice. Yep. And again, the Leviticus version of the Ten Commandments, which is Leviticus chapter 19. So right, the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, we have them twice, once in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy. But Leviticus chapter 19 also has some of those same laws repeated, right? Like honoring your father and mother, keeping Shabbat, and like believing in God. That formulation of the core central commands of the Jewish people, right? That formulation of them begins with and you shall be holy because God is holy. And in that passage, what it asks you to love is the stranger and the neighbor, not necessarily God, right? And you shall love the neighbor as yourself is in that passage, right? So, I think there's something to that, right? We're commanded to fear our parents, and we're commanded to love God. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's more to love than just doing good stuff for the person, for the other. I mean, in terms of God performing mitzvot and following God's directives, but there's more to it. There's an internal process, an internal thing that we're commanded to do that goes beyond action somehow. But
can you command someone to love? I mean, you don't love.
The Torah seems to be doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I don't think the Torah.
Respect. You can command someone to obey a commandment, but
right.
You can't say, "I command you to love." I mean,
yet it seems to do that.
I think that when the Torah says, "And you shall love,"
be commanded to love. I mean, if someone told me you have to love this person, I'm not going to say, "Okay." I mean, if they say you have to respect this person, I say, "Sure, I can do that, no problem."
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes farther than respect. I think it's love is obligations, each to the other. And those obligations have actions. It might also have some kind of an emotional component, right? I'm not trying to strip like marriage or anything of the emotional stuff, right? The emotional stuff is very important. It's just that I think that when the Torah is talking about love, it certainly isn't just an emotional component. It is deeper than that. So, okay, I want to turn us a little bit to thinking about this idea of the covenants of being and becoming intertwining. And we started talking about this when Mishka commented, and I said, yeah, but think about all of Jewish history, right? When we talk about the rabbis of the Talmud, right? Rabbis of the Talmud, imagine like this huge compendium of what it means to live Jewishly, right? And what we're talking about is like a dozen families, maybe like a dozen families and like a couple of communities that are influenced by those families, right? We're talking about a very small number of people, but, right, we know from history that at the time of sort of the height of the Roman Empire, something like between 5 and 10% of the Roman Empire was considered themselves Jewish. Now, those folks, most of them all converted to Christianity in the 4th century of the Common Era. But a lot of them before that, like, circumcised their children, like lived in Jewish communities, thought of themselves as Jewish, but they were not rabbinic Jews the way that we imagine like rabbinic Jews today. Like, what made them Jewish was that they told this story of, yeah, I'm Jewish. And like Nehemiah is talking about all these Jews who sin and sin and sin, meaning they worship other gods, they follow up, they follow the practices of the Canaanite peoples that they live among. They're not, committed to centralization of Jerusalem, right? They're right. All of the the reforms, when you read the Book of Kings, okay, and the Book of Kings was written by the victors. They want you to think that Josiah is a great king. They want you to think that Hezekiah is a great king, right? But these reformers, the reformer kings, their reigns lasted for a blip, but like King Ahab, right? Jezebel, right? That reign lasted for like 45 years. The worst of them all, not Yerevam, but it'll come to me, right? The worst kings were kings for the ones that the Bible says, and they worshiped other gods, and they made treaties with other nations, and they did all this stuff that the prophets are saying, don't do this, right? Those ones had successful, peaceful reigns, right? Like Hezekiah, his reign was marked by the invasion of the Assyrians and the destruction of the entire northern kingdoms. I mean, when we think about what Jews were actually doing, in fact, the periods in Jewish history where people did what Daniel Hartman calls God's aspiration for Judaism, right? For what people could be, right? When you think about the Jews who were actually doing Jewish as their expression of Judaism, it's comparatively few. And when you think about Judaism today, that's true also, right? Most Jews today, both here and in Israel, are not doing Jewish in the way that the rabbis imagine what doing Jewish means. Now, our understanding of what doing Jewish means has expanded somewhat, right? I was just talking about in my Tuesday class that when I think about what qualifies you to be a witness in a holy document, like the traditional standard is keeping Shabbat and keeping kosher, right? And for me, what that means is having some kind of a Shabbat practice, having some kind of a kosher practice, right? Having a relationship with these laws, right? So in other words, my understanding of what it means to be doing Jewish has expanded. But in spite of that, expansion of what it means to do Jewish, there are still comparatively few folks who are doing it. Most American Jews are not. And I think that in most periods of Jewish history, you could stand there and say, yeah, most Jews today are Jews of being, not Jews of becoming. Marie.
That means Maimonides would have very harsh things to say about those folks.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
About us.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, look, I think
Not
think
what you're saying. That would
I
cut
think
you off.
He
Right,
wouldn't
I
agree
think-
with he wouldn't agree with the one that was going to admit the Anglican back into the fold.
No. Maimonides and the Tzitz Eliezer are definitely not seeing eye to eye on this one.
Yeah.
But I do think, right, we are not Maimonides, and most Jewish thinkers are not Maimonides. We're very informed by Maimonidean thinking, but like even in his own time, Maimonides was very starkly criticized for his distillation of Judaism into this intellectual project. Like even in Maimonides' time, people were like, Maimonides, Judaism is not Neo-Aristotelian. Like, I understand what you're trying to do here, where you're trying to bring Aristotle's, Greek theology, Greek ideology and conform it to Jewish thinking, right? It's a very important project in terms of history and philosophy, but it is not, it certainly doesn't match like the Talmud's idea of Judaism, which is completely multivocal. And, right, Maimonides didn't cite his sources. So like when you read Mishnah Torah, he says, and this is the law, but he doesn't say how he knows it. And so immediately upon his death, the Mishnah, even before he died, really, the Mishnah Torah started to be printed with glosses that explained where he was getting his ideas from, right? You can read the Mishnah Torah with the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah explains, Maimonides is quoting from this page of the Talmud, or Maimonides is informed by this, by this passage from other law codes, other sources. And Maimonides really tried to be like, yeah, all you need is my book, right? And he said of himself, from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses, right? But because his name was Moses, Maimonides. We don't read Maimonides like that. We read Maimonides with a whole set of commentaries around him. He would hate that. He tried to take the commentary off the page, but we said no, you can't have Judaism without multivocality. So we disagree with Maimonides very strongly. Yeah, Murray.
I was, how shall I say, elated when I heard Reb Hartman use the word aspirational from God's point of view, because I felt it gave us some redemptive value here, because our life is aspirational as well. And the things that we try to fulfill the commandments, first of all, the acceptance, and then the doing of what, however little, however much each one of us may do, it is heading in that direction. so it is aspirational, and it ain't over yet.
Yeah.
And so I think it gives us opportunity to fit in and continue and hope to do more.
That's why it's becoming. Yeah, I think that's right. We're not the Judaism of became. Yeah, the Judaism of becoming. We're in process, continually in process, and I think that's right. And I think that's what sort of. I think that's part of the beauty of it. Yes, Steve, I saw your hand.
So when you said, unfortunately, I've lost exactly what your words were. Something about we strongly reject Maimonides. I think there's a distinction to be made here between the multivocality of the Talmud, which says these and these are the words of the living God, and then the I don't want to say univocality, but at least in the end there is one halakha. The halakha follows the words of Beit Hillel, and I'm not so sure that while we would reject Maimonides' choices of what the halakha is, that all of us would reject his notion that there is the thing that is the halakha. And it's not a question of, well, I interact with the kosher laws in this way, or I interact with the kosher laws in that way. If we accept that the Shulchan Aruch is normative, which I realize we don't, but if we did for a second, then we would say that that is the settled halakha. Even if we don't accept the Shulchan Aruch, at some point, if I talk to my rabbi and my rabbi says, this is how you keep kosher, this is the halakha of kashrut, am I allowed to say, well, I think it's multivocal, I'm going to go do something else? Or do I have to acknowledge that while there are multiple Talmudic rights, some people do Pas Yisrael and some don't, at some level, there is the halakha, and it's not according to Beit Shammai, it's according to Beit Hillel. And so I don't think we reject Maimonides as strongly as you're suggesting we do. I think that we disagree with him about what the halakha is, but I don't want to speak for everybody, but at least many conservative Jews, the more observant among us, would argue that there is in fact a halakha, or at least a range within halakha.
Yeah, so I agree with you that there's a range within halakha, right? But, we are a part of a movement where the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards can issue a ruling saying this is the law, and a ruling saying this other thing is the law on the same topic, and both can pass the CJLS, and both can be understood as the words of the living God, even though they might actually be different answers to the same question. And so I agree with you that there is a range, right? But to say that something is the halakha when we know that there is another thing that is, right? We could say our practice is, or our community's practice, right? I'll give you an example, right? I read the sources early on in this pandemic and decided that to count in a minyan, you have to be seen and heard on Zoom. It means that our services are a little cacophonous at times, and that every once in a while we have to mute somebody who gets a phone call during services, right? We have started with the willingness of the ritual committee. We've started a Tuesday morning minyan with a synagogue that says you just have to be seen, but you don't have to be heard to count in the minyan. And so every other Tuesday we'll be following their practice, and every other Tuesday we'll be following our practice. And for them, like doing it our way is going to be jarring and weird and kind of cacophonous, and they're going to have to get used to that. And for us, like we did it their way this past Tuesday, and I heard from a couple of people like, wow, it was quiet. It was weird to have davening where I couldn't hear other people butting in. And right, so both of those are legitimate options according to the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. My understanding is a little more rigid, but I'm comfortable with the fact that our conservative movement has multiple options, and for the sake of community, a broader sense of community, we can join together on Tuesday mornings and switch off our different practices. And same with their rabbis; they were perfectly okay with every other Tuesday going our way. So it's, I agree with you. So let me rephrase my rejection of Maimonides. I think what I was saying is not to reject any of Maimonides' particular halakha or Maimonides' idea that there is a halakha. I think what I was rejecting is sort of Maimonides' insistence on that you have to believe in these 13 principles of faith to be Jewish. That's a starting point for entry into Jewish community, and that you have to believe that the Torah is consistent with Aristotelian philosophy, right? To be a sort of a true believer in Torah, which I don't think is fair to the Torah itself or to the range of possible interpretations that the Torah can give us, but which Maimonides really felt. But yeah, if you thought that there were actually angels, or that the Torah speaks in anything other than metaphor, or that God appeared in anything other than a dream, right? Like in this week's Torah portion, it says literally that Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu saw the feet of God, right? Like for Maimonides, that's like a complete impossibility. But for me, I actually think that there's something very spiritual about the idea that their experience of God was visual. Even if you press me on it, I would probably say, yeah, I don't think that God has a body. But I would say, sure, the Torah imagines that God has a body. When the Torah says that we're made in the image of God, it means we look like God. The Torah imagines that God's body looks like our body. Bas, I think you were going to say something.
Well, no, I wasn't.
No, not Bob. Not Bob, Bas.
So where I would reject Maimonides is that last part that you read, where you have to hate and destroy people that are not agreeing with you, or not following the laws to how you think they should be followed.
Yeah, I totally hear that. Although, like I said, I think there are people who are not fully realizing the potential for God's reflection into the world. That's not the same as wanting to hate or destroy them. But I do think that they are maybe misunderstanding or misreading Judaism. All right, let's look at this conversation, and then we'll close with a short discussion of it. All right, here we go. Yeah, okay.
In the last lecture, we explored the narrative of the covenant of becoming, where Judaism is no longer simply who you are, or it's not just who you are. It's not just a sense of identity, ethnicity, a connection to a story, a past, with its notions of loyalty, solidarity, responsibility. But that Jewishness is also about striving. It's about striving to become. It's about striving to do. It's about recognizing that I have a responsibility to engage in a journey which in many ways never ends. Today, I'm joined by Ilana Steinhain and Shai Zarchi. Thank you for being with us. One of the challenges of becoming that I spoke about at the end of the lecture speaks about how becoming sometimes creates distinctions between Jews who are holier, Jews who are less holy, Jews who are becoming more or further on this journey, even though no one ever gets there, but who are more advanced, between good Jews and bad Jews. How does that category play out in your thinking about Jews of becoming or its consequences?
So I think it's a really interesting question because, to be honest, my whole Judaism of being, my connection to the Jewish people as a whole, comes from my Judaism of becoming. It's not undermined by it, meaning my Judaism of being comes from Genesis 12. It comes
That's part of your book.
meaning that's the Torah, meaning the Torah tells us that God says to Abraham, this is going to be your progeny. It does not say this is going to be the people who pray like this, or this is going to be the people who do tikkun olam. It says your progeny is going to be this treasured people. Now, I don't know why that's the decision that's made. That's God's decision, not mine. But what I do know is that it stretches me to think that the foundation of my Judaism of becoming, where I know we're going to disagree, of course there are types of Judaisms that I think are maybe misguided, maybe misinterpretations, things that I would feel uncomfortable with personally, but you can't erase the first 12 chapters of Genesis. You can't erase the first 18 chapters of Genesis. You just can't erase it.
So like in the lecture, when I was arguing that Judaism does best when the two are synthesized, you're even synthesizing it more deeply. And you're saying these aren't just simply, they're not two different covenants. For you, the covenant of being is an integral part of your covenant of becoming. And you can't have a covenant of becoming. It's not as if I have two covenants that I have to bridge. That's what this, once it's Torah,
yeah,
it's the covenant of becoming. And therefore they could never threaten each other. You're an interesting person, Shai. You're very often someone would have put you in classic Israel under the category of secular. And but anybody who knows you, you're the antithesis of these boxes. What does Judaism of becoming mean to you? And what place does it have in your Jewish life?
אני מאמין מאוד ביהדות של התרחבות, ככה אני קורא לזה. זאת אומרת שאני זוכר שהייתי צעיר, שאנשים היו חוזרים בתשובה אל העולם האורתודוקסי, היו עוזבים לגמרי את העולם שלהם, ועושים המרה לעולם אחר לגמרי. בעולם שלי, שאני גדלתי, כבר התחילה אפשרות להרחיב את הזהות מהעולם החילוני הזה שהיינו, כי הרגשנו ברגע מסוים רבים, שזה עולם צר מדי. זה אין בו עולם... למה? דתיות זה דבר של כל אדם, לדעתי. זאת אומרת, זה לא נכס של דתיים. לפעמים הפוך. דתיות היא בכלל לא נכס של דתיים, אבל אני אומר, זה לא רק של דתיים. זאת אומרת, דתיות היא...
דתיים in the Israeli sense of Orthodox.
Yes.
In many ways, that's part of the girdle. That we're this little box.
עכשיו, אבל גם אצלנו החילוניים, שכאילו הכל פתוח, והכל מותר, ואנחנו לא ממושמעים להלכה, העולם נעשה צר יותר ויותר, בתוך איזו קופסה של חילוניות, שבעצם היא לא אפשרה, לא מגעה, לא עם תפילה, ולא עם חוויה יהודית כלשהי, ולא עם תורה, באופן אינטנסיבי, ובעצם יצא מצב שהציונות, שבאה לגאול אותנו, היא בעצם יצרה אותנו קצת עבדים, של איזה משהו הרבה יותר צר, ואנחנו ניסינו לפתוח את הדבר הזה. עכשיו, מה זה יהדות של התרחבות? מה שאני רואה, זה שלא רק חילוניים הולכים ומתרחבים אל תוך המסורת, אל כל מיני סוגים של מגע עם מסורת, אלא גם אורתודוקסים וגם רפורמים וגם קונסרבטיביים. התנועה הזאת של הפתיחה, להיות יותר רחבים ממה שאני בהגדרה הראשונה שלי, זו תנועה הכי מאפיינת היום את האמצע של החברה היהודית בישראל. בשביל זה צריך מנהיגות מיוחדת, שפה חדשה. אבל משהו שונה כבר. החלוקה הזאת לדתיים וחילונים שכל כך הרבה שנים, ועד היום התקשורת והפוליטיקה עוד מדברת אותה, היא כבר שפה לא נכונה.
So it's not the distinction in Israel between, or your life's work is to make sure that the distinction between religious and secular is not a distinction between the covenant of being and the covenant of becoming, but it's to create hitrachavut, more expansiveness within the covenant of becoming.
אני מרגיש שההתרחבות, צריך להבין אותה, היא בעצם קשורה לאיזו ביוגרפיה רוחנית, שאצלי למשל יש בה חילוניות מאוד עמוקה, שהיא לא עברה מן העולם ברגע שנפתחתי לתוך היהדות של המקורות ושל התפילה וכו', אלא אני פשוט הרגשתי שמשהו בחילוניות הזאת, הוא מקבל איזה רזוננס, איזה תהודה, הרבה יותר עמוקה ברגע שאני ממלא את כל מי שאני נולדתי להיות. אני נולדתי יהודי עם היסטוריה גדולה, עם מקורות נפלאים, ובעצם כל זמן שהייתי מאוד מאוד מנותק ומכוון רק למשימה החלוצית להאחז באדמה בעמק יזרעאל, ההרגשה ברגע מסוים הייתה שאי אפשר יותר לחיות עם הצרות הזאת, איפה כל עולם הרוח, איפה כל עולם הפתוס החברתי, הפתוס וכולי. היה פתוס של צדק וכל מיני דברים מסוימים שבאו מהעולם הסוציאליסטי.
How did this Judaism of becoming, how did it expand? What does it contain for you now? As a secular or expanding Jew, whatever category
אני
you want to
מרגיש
put yourself.
שהמשימה שלנו היא בעצם משימה של התרחבות אל תוך הזהות המלאה יותר שלנו. אני רואה את זה בזרמים שונים בתוך היהדות הישראלית, כאשר אצלי למשל, הרעיון הוא לקחת, הרי אני גדלתי למשל על צדק חברתי שבא מתוך הסוציאליזם האירופי. לא היה לו שום קשר, לא לתורה ולא לתורה שבעל פה ולא לשום דבר. כן, ולא לנביאים, למרות שהפתוס הזה אמר, אנחנו עם הנביאים, בגלל זה אנחנו, חזון הנביאים, אנחנו מתנגדים בעיקר לריטואלס, כן? אבל אני אומר, התחושה היא שאני לומד לדבר את האינטואיציות האינטלקטואליות בשפה יהודית. זה מסע, זה האסנס, זה מסע, ואני מרגיש שמבחינת הכוח של זה, להתמיד, יהיה לזה כוח הרבה יותר גדול. קשה מאוד לתרבות לשמור את הערכים הכי עמוקים שלה רק בשפות זרות. רק בשפות שהן לא מתוך התרבות פנימה, לא מתוך הפרטיקולרי, רק אוניברסלי. זה לא עובד הדבר הזה, אני מרגיש. וחלק מהתיאוריה שלי, של ההיחלשות, של הפתוס של הצדק שהיה לסבא וסבתא שלי, לעומת מה שקורה היום, זה קשור בזה שהם לא העבירו לנו את הכלי, את הקונטיינר הזה, של התורה כדי להחזיק בעזרתו.
European socialism was not going to be enough for you. It has to come within Judaism. Shai raised this issue of particularism, universalism, and I want to go back to North American Jewry a second, Ilana. What is the status of, when you look at the community, how is the Judaism of becoming doing in the midst of a society which has a lot of debates about universalism, particularism, which we're going to deal with in the next session?
Well, so one of the things that Shai just said really just sort of took me maybe by surprise at how explicit you were with it, that you're saying that your intuitions were being affirmed by Judaism. And I think that in America right now, Judaism has taken on a form of what are my intuitions and how can Judaism help affirm them for me? And I think that is a problem in the Judaism of becoming, because if that's the reason why you're there, I don't care if you're right wing, you're left wing. If that's the reason why you're there, then by definition, if people want their intuitions validated, they can find it elsewhere.
You're really not becoming.
You're not.
Becoming is a journey of exploration,
Correct.
of learning, of challenging.
Correct.
All you're doing, it's actually a stagnant
and
under the guise of becoming.
And I think it's an educational problem.
Becoming. Okay, let's deal with it, because you're pointing to a great challenge of becoming.
Yep.
What happens when becoming is really it's just reaffirming, and it's not challenging. It doesn't move you.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was having a conversation with a group of students who were here visiting for the summer, pluralistic group, and I was talking about this question of, like, what happens if you've never seen anything in a Jewish text that challenges you? And this kid comes up to me afterwards. He says, oh my gosh, I've never seen anything in a Jewish text that challenges me.
And he or
that I
she had
disagree
12
with it.
years of Jewish education.
Correct. And I said,
At
hold up.
$45,000 a year. At $40,000.
Correct. So I said, whoa. He said, how do I find it? I said, I'll send you a bibliography. I'll send you plenty of, but he, you know, with the honesty of a teenager who's in formation, he sort of said, whoa, you're right. And then what happens is we just end up in our ruts, and we end up, they're not ruts, there are paths, but are those paths ever challenged? Do we grow? Do we push ourselves?
So you just, really interesting. I asked you about the challenges of the Jewishness of becoming, and you answered from one aspect within the Orthodox, or with whether it's within the Orthodox or within the community which is very observant, where you could engage in Torah, but engaging in Torah is not the same as the covenant of becoming. And I think that's, like Dayenu, like, great, thank you, I'm really happy, I'm going to take that home and want to think, that's a real big one. But now, very often, especially from Israel, people love to look at, from the outside, and what's missing. And they're seen, or at least from an Israeli perspective, American Jewry is challenged. Canadian Jewry is not the same, and it's a more complicated story, as their recent survey showed. But what is the status of the Judaism of becoming in the larger American Jewish community?
Well, so clarifying, I wasn't just talking about the Orthodox community.
Good.
I was talking about the Jewish community that I see all the places I teach throughout the country.
Everybody wants to reaffirm.
Correct. That's a huge problem. And you know what? In some communities, great, you reaffirm, you stay where you are, you're fine. In other communities, what do I need this to reaffirm it? I'll find affirmation somewhere else. So, people say there's an issue of literacy in just Jewish literacy. I think that's true. I don't think we're teaching American Jews, and I can't say for Canada, I don't think we're teaching American Jews Hebrew well enough so that they can make decisions on their own and actually confront the text. But I think that's actually a symptom of something else, which is we don't want people to actually confront. We don't want people to actually be, plenty of people want that. That's not the way our systems are constructed.
לנו יש בעיה הפוכה שאנחנו לא רוצים להסכים, לא שלא רוצים להתעמת.
Right. We want, because we can go in our little silos and we can have, but I would love for there to be in each and every community groups that actually argue over stuff, for real. Not argue over what our policies are going to be on X, Y, and Z,
So
but
in that
argues
sense,
over values.
don't worry so much about the potential divisiveness of the Judaism because I wish you would actually take an idea seriously that you would actually want to argue with somebody about it.
Yes, amazing, make it Talmudic.
One of the stories about Israeli Judaism over the last 20 years is that Israelis, there used to be this conversation that Israelis see themselves as Israelis and not Jews. And we know that that's not the case anymore. So we know that Israeli Jews are doing a lot of stuff. At least on the surface, they're doing a lot of Judaisms of becoming. Whether they're challenging themselves is a real interesting question, Ilana, but they're doing a lot of things. They're engaged in rituals, they're engaged in study projects. How do you see this whole renewal, this return? Is it a Judaism of becoming or is it a Judaism of being? Where do you see Israelis at?
תראה, אני לא יודע איך להכניס את זה בדיוק לתוך הקטגוריות האלה, אבל אני אגיד לך מה אני חושב על זה. אני חושב שהעיקר הוא היום היצירה שנוצרת במרחב המשותף שבין אנשים שפורצים מהזרמים שלהם החוצה. שם המקום הכי מעניין בתרבות הישראלית היום. זאת אומרת, אנשים שבאים מהאורתודוקסיה ומהחילוניות ומהרפורמים, ופתאום יש איזה שטח משותף שיכולה להיווצר בו איזו יצירה משותפת, שם גם אנשים מתרחבים, ושם הם מרגישים את היתרון הגדול שהם נמצאים ביחד. שהם בעצם החברה הישראלית היהודית יוצרת כאן משהו חדש. עכשיו, הנושא שלה הוא, אני קורא לזה בשעת המכנסים פזר. היות והתכנסנו לשתי ישויות גדולות של יהודים בעולם היהודי, ארצות הברית וישראל, ישראל וארצות הברית. בעצם היום השאלה היא בארץ, היא איך אנחנו מתפזרים לכל מיני גוונים ונשארים להרגיש יותר ויותר שאנחנו אחד. זאת אומרת, איך עושים את זה? איך יש פה יהדות אתיופיה שהיא לא חייבת להיות אורתודוקסית כדי להתקבל, ואיך יש פה חילוניים שהם לא חייבים להיות רפורמים כדי להתקבל, אלא כל אחד עם הניואנס שלו, אבל השראה הדדית, ובעצם יש לנו איזה פתאום הרבה מאוד גוונים, זה מין פאזל כזה שהולך ונוצר. זה בעיניי היצירה שקורית היום, אותי מרתקת היצירה הזאת, ואני מרגיש שאי אפשר יותר כבר לעשות אותה כל אחד רק במקומו. אלה לבד ואלה לבד ואלה לבד. זה הסיבה שבגללה הגעתי למכון הרטמן.
So what you're almost arguing is that the only way to do the Judaism of becoming is actually to embrace the denominationalism.
נכון.
Because then it's another side of the answer, which Ilana gave beforehand, but it's different, is that I could only do becoming today if I do it in multiple places, each one enriching the other.
But this seems like a 21st century phenomenon because there are plenty of Jews in North America who are experiencing the same feeling. They don't want, even people who have very strong Judaism of becoming, and I'm not just talking about Orthodox, I'm talking about Reform Jews, I'm talking about secular Jews, I'm talking about renewal Jews, I'm talking about conservative Jews, and people who don't want labels at all, that they find some enrichment by being with Jews who have a different Judaism of becoming. There's a phenomenon here that's not just about Israelis living all together. I think there's just how people find themselves is not necessarily within their lanes always.
So the becoming which used to divide us, and when you want to unite us is you have to transcend becoming. Both of you are saying actually that was in the 20th century. In the 21st century, Jewish peoplehood becomes stronger when we learn how to engage in becoming together. And you're saying that's what people actually want because they're not interested in being stuck in one particular. Then maybe they could actually move out of their comfort zone.
But let's be honest, that's what people like us want, right?
Okay,
Meaning,
that's not bad.
No,
In
it's
our
not
world,
bad.
This, if we could bring the Messiah tomorrow.
It's not bad.
It's
but
not too bad.
but there's also, I mean, look, I'm going to tell a very American story. We're working right now in America on the question of, is it worth actually being with somebody else who disagrees with you? Should we have just split at the Civil War? Is that what should have just happened? Meaning, and that's a very serious challenge to what we're talking about. So you have both of these going on at once, and I think it's a very dynamic, I would say even explosive argument that's going on right now between uniformity and diversity in terms of what makes for the richest, most flourishing person.
The reality is, and especially the experience of so many Jews outside of Israel, is that the Jews of becoming in Israel are the ones who are taking Israel away from them. Is the Judaism of becoming of some Jews in Israel a great danger for Jewish people?
אני מרגיש יש לי כמה דאגות בעניין, בתהליך הזה שאני מדבר עליו. דבר אחד, אני מרגיש שהיהודים שעובדים, כמו במכון הרטמן, בחזית של המהלכים של התפתחות היהדות הישראלית והעולמית, הם מפסידים במלחמה עם התקשורת מצד אחד ועם הפוליטיקה מצד שני, על ההגדרות של המצב העכשווי של היהדות. זאת אומרת, בפוליטיקה ובתקשורת ממשיכים לדבר על פירוד, וגם יוצרים פירוד, מפחידים אחד מהשני, וגם יוצרים כל הזמן הרגשה שלעולם ועד הקטגוריות, אורתודוקסי, רפורמי, חילוני, וזה,
Your feeling is that besides certain extremes, maybe those who have greater political power, but your feeling is that the
אבל אני מרגיש שאנחנו צריכים לפתח, אנחנו צריכים להוביל שפה חדשה. שפה חדשה לתאר את הזהויות, את מה שקורה פה. ואנחנו לא מצליחים עדיין לתאר את זה.
Ilana, as we conclude, I want to ask you one. This being and becoming is about the narrative of Jewish peoplehood. What do you feel is the primary threat to Jewish peoplehood? When I heard in your first answer how for you being is just such an integral part of your becoming, I felt so excited, and then I felt, oh, how do we have more Ilanas out there? But what's the dangers to Jewish? What's threatening our peoplehood today?
So here are my top three. Okay, the first is guilt by association. If I am embarrassed or ashamed or seek to distance myself from Jews with whom I disagree, or Jews who do things, I'm not talking about things that are criminal, okay? I'm talking about Jews who are less educated than I am in whatever. Jews who are too liberal for my interests. Guilt by association. That's a killer of Jewish peoplehood.
I don't want to be associated with you because then I'm guilty.
Correct. Because that reflects on me. You know what reflects on you? Not wanting to be associated. That reflects on you. That's the first. The second is reciprocity. You can't have a peoplehood unless people are doing things for each other. If there is one group always serving the other group and there's no reciprocity there, forget about it. If you're living in different communities and you don't meet each other and figure out how you can do for each other, And you know what? With reciprocity, the thing that I see is the most frustrating is that sometimes in order to get reciprocity, you have to do a lot of unilateral stuff.
First.
Yup, you have to
If
try
you're gonna wait,
and try
I'm like, as
and
though
try.
saying, I'll do reciprocity after they do reciprocity first.
Exactly. And
That's the paradox.
it doesn't work. That's not the way it works. Somebody has to start and somebody has to do it again and again and again until finally they can break through. And sometimes you're talking to the wrong person. Sometimes you're talking to the wrong head of an institution, the wrong head of a community, the wrong types of people. So every Jew who's in that community is the same. Try again, right? So that's the second.
And the third?
The third is multiple identities.
That's a challenge to Jewish people.
Look, I don't want to, it's fine in and of itself. It's just hard to say what would make loyalty to Jews your primary priority if you're also a lot of different things and you have a lot of peoplehoods.
In many ways, the challenge of multiple identities is dealt with precisely by the Judaism of becoming. That if you're going to have multiple identities regardless, but if this identity is meaningful and important, it's the one that you'll visit more often, and then it will claim you. And then even though Jewish peoplehood won't be your exclusive, it will be something that's important in your life. Shai, Ilana, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
All right, well, one or two thoughts.
I don't like that guy, Hartman.
I think he's very cool.
I don't like him.
Ilana made-
That's not relevant to
Danielle.
the conversation.
Why?
Danielle. Among
No.
other things, he's
Oh,
rude,
Danielle.
but that's
Danielle?
just my first thought.
All right,
Ilana made very good points.
Yeah, I really liked her.
Yes.
Alana,
Yes.
you know, she works at Columbia. We could probably get her to come to our community. Alana Steinheim, like I've learned with her. I bet you
Right.
we could get her to come up. She's great. Although I don't agree with her on everything. She's
I
orthodox.
noticed that. She said a couple of things I was pretty sure you would disagree with rather
Yeah.
strongly.
Yeah, but I do really, I find myself very compelled by her.
Yeah. The thing she said that really resonated with me is that, and this one I scribbled down what you're saying is, what are my intuitions and how can Judaism help me affirm them? Because if you can get your affirmation from someplace else, if Judaism won't give it to you, then you won't have any connection. And I see so many people who are coming in and they already know what they think, and their problem is to figure out which, how do I make Judaism conform to me? And I think she's exactly, if you're not getting, if it's not pushing back against you, it's not, at the very least, it's not doing what it claims like it's supposed to be doing for you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that aspect of what you said. Right, Judaism shouldn't just be about being like a yes man to us. Judaism should force us to confront our capacity for change. Yeah, I agree with that. Any other thoughts? All right, well, we've reached our time boundary, so we'll hold on to your thoughts and definitely share them with me over the course of the week. And we'll join back together next week. Next week, we're going to look at stories of Jewish people. Next week, we're going to look at this issue of universalism and particularism as it relates to the American Jewish community and to the Israeli Jewish community. There are comparatively few textual sources, so if you want to look at them in advance, that's good. There's one from the Mishnah, then a few from Genesis, some that we've seen before, but here being employed for a different purpose. And the essays, the like background reading, are particularly interesting, especially what's labeled here in background meaning readings, section number 5 and number 6 and number 7. So what you're going to see there is Daniel Gordis writing very publicly in 2012, around the time of the last Gaza war, not the one that was this past spring, but the one before that. He felt like the American Jewish community. Daniel Gordis is a person who has made Aliyah, right? And his kids are in the army. He writes this article being extremely, extremely upset that American Jews are not unequivocally supportive of Israel. And he specifically attacks Sharon Brous publicly. Sharon Brous is the rabbi who's at Ikar in LA. And he really, really criticizes her very harshly. And then she wrote back also in the print media attacking Gordis. So that's 5 and 6. And those sections are well worth the read. So do spend some time on the background reading materials, because I'm going to refer to them a few times in our discussion. I think it's very, very fascinating. So, all right, see you next week.